right? So what would you think if someone now, as a Westerner, still want to go to China to work, compared to the time you went? Is there any difference? And, or are there still similar things that they should follow?
Great question, Jiang Ting. So I think whenever I first studied and indeed worked in Beijing and Shanghai and other cities, is that at that time, whenever you were looking at job adverts, at the very foot of the job description or whatever, it would say languages, and it would oftentimes say English. And then it might say, well, actually, at the very beginning, it wouldn't even mention Chinese or Mandarin. And what I've kind of noticed over these last 15, 16 years is that year after year, the expectation for your Mandarin language ability has increased year after year. So we've seen it go through the ability to say a few words, to conversational Chinese, to intermediate level, to where I think we've probably got to the point whereby it's a prerequisite to be able to speak Mandarin Chinese in the vast majority of the jobs. Now, it's not to say, I mean, if you have some special skill, which I'm sure lots of the people on this call do have, they may be technologists or scientists, which I'm definitely not. So I rely much more on my linguistic ability. But I think, yeah, if you have those more technical capabilities, it's not to say like you couldn't get by working in some of the major cities and some of the major projects. But I do think that it makes sense to learn the language. Indeed, if you have a long-term engagement or strategy when it comes to working with China. I mean, also the interesting thing is that, remember, I think it was last year, one of the very good digests on Chinese politics comes from Politico. They come out every week. It's usually on a Thursday. And on their China Watcher newsletter, they had a piece, it was maybe June or July time last year, whereby people were talking about how when it comes to expertise on China, you should have a +1. So if you, like me, geographically or politically are very interested in China, you should have a +1, and your +1 should be, I don't know, biology, or it should be computer coding, or it should be marketing, or whatever else. I think you need to have at least those two strands to make a career in China in the future.
Yeah, so China plus and Chinese plus, right?
Yeah.
Yes, so that totally makes sense. So for those years you worked in China, you had mainly, I think it was for FCO as a head of communications, and so did you? I mean, what was the biggest learning you had, and also what sort of learning you brought back to the work here, specifically career sort of side, not geopolitics?
Yeah, so you know, I was thinking about this before us catching up today, and I think to give it a bit of a historical context is that I think sometimes one of the key advantages that China has and or the Chinese people have is the ability to learn and the ability to be humble when I say you collectively, when you come to something, is that you kind of come from this starting block of like, there's much more to learn about the world. And I think we've seen that throughout China's kind of recent kind of modern history, because sometimes historically people will say that in the 19th century, maybe 200, 150 years ago or more, is that when China was going through a declinist phase, a lot of that was maybe due to believing that it didn't have anything to learn from the rest of the world, and that China had everything under this celestial kind of empire, and there was nothing to learn from the Yangren or the Waiguoren or whatever else. And I think that China, towards the end of the 19th century, that began to change. So you had like the kind of, how's it you say in Chinese, like Yue Yang, Yun Dong, and Li Hongzhang, and you had all these great thinkers from that late 19th and early 20th century. And I think one of the key elements of that, Jiang Ting, was that the Chinese elites at that time had realized that they had to learn from the West. And so you had lots of people, most of the leaders that came through in China in the 1920s, and the 1940s and 50s, people like Sun Yat-sen, people like Zhou Enlai or Deng Xiaoping or whoever it happened to be, that they had spent time overseas, whether it was in Japan or Russia or France or in the United Kingdom, because they believed that they had much more to learn. And I think we've seen that after China opened up 改革开放 from the late 70s, 1980s, 90s. You know, it's kind of evidential when you look at the sheer number of Chinese students we have in the United Kingdom, the sheer number of Chinese students you have in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, is because Chinese people want to learn, and they want to learn the most advanced things, the most avant-garde things. And that's one of the key things I learned actually from being in China. And I oftentimes, when I think of the UK-China bilateral relationship, or West and East, and that sort of dynamic, is that sometimes, and I've said this very openly, and you know, I'll say it again today, is that sometimes I think the West lacks a little bit of curiosity. And especially it lacks the curiosity when it comes to China, because it focuses too much on the negative. And some of that stuff does exist, and a lot of that stuff we have to deal with. But there's also an element whereby, much like the Chinese had learned from the West in those centuries gone past, you know, maybe the UK in the 19th century, America in the 20th century, I think in the 21st century, is that there will be lots of interesting ways of doing things that will emerge in China. And I think it's incumbent on people in positions of responsibility on the call today, including myself, is to watch those things as they evolve. So that was probably the key takeaway that I had, Zhang Ting, from my time working, living, and studying there.
In fact, that's my question to you. Do you see that the UK-China relations are going to go better from now? It certainly felt like it couldn't be worse. And I see that a few pre-registration questions from people also wanted to hear your views on this.
I think I'll do it very briefly, just on your penultimate point. I'm always torn when it comes to this discussion actually on ethnic Chinese participation in politics, and to your point about having a louder voice and speaking up more, because I understand that, you know, having lived there for a number of years, that culturally this is a tricky one, because like a boss I had, a Chinese boss I had a few years back, had always said to us that, you know, it was 低调做人, 高调做事, and there is something in the culture, I think, that exists, which is a good thing. You know, I see the good side of this, in that a lot of times Chinese people will be like, you know what, it's more important to get your head down, do the thing right, and do it successful. And I applaud that. I think that's a great thing, because sometimes in our own system in the UK, or indeed in the chamber, for example, sometimes there's too much rhetoric and there's too many words and there isn't enough doing. And so I often feel torn. I feel very torn on this. I think ultimately, obviously, the Chinese diaspora, I think, has to have more of a voice, and I think does have to get involved in politics. But there's also a wisdom that I think we shouldn't give up when it comes to that. So it's kind of keeping the integrity and keeping kind of true to yourself at the same time, whilst acknowledging, whilst, you know, we work in different environments, that you have to adapt. On the golden era points, the last 2 years have been incredibly difficult, and the kind of deterioration in the bilateral relationship within 2 years, what has happened is equivalent to what's happened between the US and China over the period of 5 or 6 years. So it's been very condensed, and it's kind of dropped off the cliff. I think that it's been a bit quieter, I must admit, from a political point of view, these last few weeks or couple of months, is that the temperature has gone down a little bit in the House of Commons, perhaps after Christmas. Like, it just hasn't been as high profile as what it was during the whole of last year and the year before. But maybe you're asking me, like, what did I learn from China? I think that I'll finish on this particular point. I never really heard, before working and living in China, the phrase that there's you know, no eternal friends, there's only eternal interests. And Chinese people love saying this in different.
一分九分闭合 is that the one you're talking about?
Well, it's kind of 没有永远的朋友，只有永远的利益。And you know, it's interesting because this was actually, it came from Lord Palmerston in the 19th century in the United Kingdom political debates. And I don't know, it's a very realist way of looking at the world, but I think maybe what it tells you, like wisdom wise, is that these things don't last forever. And perhaps even though right now we're at a very low ebb and it's been at a very negative point, is that there's still hope, I believe, in the years to come, is that things can start to pick up again. Because it's very important. The UK and China and the United States has the most consequential bilateral relationship. I always say this, but the UK and China has a much more historical relationship. And it goes back much further, and it has much more depth over a longer period of time than a lot of bilateral relationships out there. And so, we're both amazing countries with fantastic civilizations and cultures and ways of doing things and literature and poetry, whatever it happens to be. There's many great things between our two countries, and we should start to see those good things and positive things yet again. But it might take some time, I think, Jiang Ting.